Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of Ethisphere's Global Ethics Summit, and to our panel, Human Rights Protection, Company Responsibility in Combating Human Trafficking. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Arti Miraj. I'm the Executive Editor and Director of Digital Content at Ethisphere, and I will be moderating this morning's panel. We have a great lineup today, and our panel will focus on a couple of areas, including how human trafficking has moved from a geographic issue to a people issue, and now it is a wider company issue, right? We'll also touch on how some companies are addressing the problem and its connection to corporate social responsibility initiatives. We'll also explore how to responsibly manage supply chains in light of new regulations. And finally, a very important topic is we will discuss reputational risk and how to get the rest of your company involved in this process. So to begin, I will have our panel of experts, no pressure, introduce themselves. That will be followed by today's discussion, and then we will reserve about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience. So with that, I will turn it over to Kim.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kimberly Schur. I'm with Marriott International, and I have the honor of appearing on behalf of Ed Ryan, our General Counsel, today. So thank you for having me.
I'm Teresa Lohr. I'm with CH2M. You may know my colleague Bill Brierley, who's a regular at these events. We're a global engineering and infrastructure firm, and I'm in charge of our global corporate affairs.
And I'm Ernie Allen. I'm a lawyer who spent 30 years running the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the United States and 16 years running the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Retired a year and a half ago, and I'm currently focusing largely on modern slavery, human trafficking issues. I'm currently chairing a campaign for the UK Prime Minister David Cameron called We Protect, that's focusing on online sexual exploitation. And I've worked very closely with someone I admire enormously, Letty Ashworth of Delta Airlines.
Thank you. I am Letty Ashworth, Director of Global Diversity at the world's best airlines, Delta Airlines. And I've certainly had the privilege of representing the company for a number of years, as Ernie stated, as we started to work in this space, and it continues to grow and is still incredibly important to the world.
Absolutely. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. So with that, at this point, I'd like to turn it over to you, Letty. If you can provide more context about human trafficking, for example, how does Delta define this issue, right? Because I feel that you need to be able to define the issue before you can actually address it. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, that's an interesting question because I think the issue is defined by the act of human trafficking. Mm-hmm. When Delta got involved approximately 5 to 6 years ago, I think we were in a place of asking the question, what is human trafficking? Literally between 2008, 2010, not many people were talking about human trafficking in its current form, or maybe they didn't know about it. Our CEO at the time, Richard Anderson, as he spoke around the world, became familiar with the issue. And as customers, as shareholders approached him, he very quickly said it is the morally right thing to do, and that is to get involved as a company. And so from that top-down messaging, I think we defined it that it is our social responsibility. It is something that's not just a thing to do, a box to check, but to truly get engaged in the fight.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you on that. Great. Kim, your thoughts on this topic?
Marriott has been involved in kind of training and raising awareness on this issue for, I would say, over 10 years as a company. And I think in a way we recognized it's kind of the ethical and right thing to do as a company. Our motto is how we do business is as important as the business that we do. And really, in a way, we have kind of this unique opportunity, if you will, because we're sometimes on the front lines, because the reality is hotels are often kind of a place where this type of activity often occurs. And so we viewed it as our ethical obligation to begin to raise awareness. And so that's something we've worked on.
Mm-hmm. It's a great point of raising awareness, and to Letty's point of getting everyone involved, right? That's very important. Do you have any thoughts on that, given your expertise?
Are you
Ernie?
coming to me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think the points that are made are exactly right. I mean, the reality is most people think that slavery ended a century ago, and it didn't. Slavery is alive and well in the world today. The International Labor Organization estimates 21 million people a year are utilized, abused in forced labor in modern slavery. An Australian mining billionaire, Andrew Forrest, launched something called the Global Slavery Index, and his estimates are even higher than that, 28, 30 million people a year. The UN estimates that 1.8 million children are used every year for commercial sex. So this is not some minor issue that people don't need to think about. And I would argue that it's particularly relevant for corporations and businesses. In this world of globalization, the reality is most of us now have supply chains that are far beyond our reach and control, and we have to take steps to address that. Just in November, the world's largest food company announced that Nestle announced that it had discovered that its supply chains in India were tainted through the use of forced labor, immigrant labor, unpaid personnel. So this can happen to anybody. And 30 years ago, when I began to work on this issue, a police commander said to me, the only way not to find this problem is simply not to look for it. The good news is that the world has begun to look. The bad news is, for example, people and executives in this country, with the exception of some of the people on the stage here, still think this is a problem that only happens somewhere else on the other side of the world. Let me tell you, it's happening on Main Street, USA, as well as around the world. So I would suggest, Artie, that this is a significant issue that we need to do far more in mobilizing private business to address.
Right. To your point about mobilizing this entire issue and bringing awareness, regulations play a very important role, right? So how are regulations shaping the way that companies address this issue? Any thoughts on that, Teresa?
Well, we're in the engineering and consulting and construction sector, and in some of the countries where we operate, there is no native population to do the kind of manual labor that's needed for major infrastructure projects. So in those cases, and these are quite often countries in the Gulf states, in like Qatar, UAE, where labor needs to be brought in, and that opens up the whole spectrum of human trafficking issues. So for us, as the consultants to the engineer, to the owner, to the big project developer at the very top, to the oftentimes government agency or major infrastructure program at the very top of the chain, we're advising on a number of engineering and program management ideas, and what needs to be done and what they need to get enough gravel into the country and meet environmental regulations. But this issue has come into our workforce, into our work stream now, because this is part of what we offer to clients is how can you build something that's going to last and be done in an ethical way. And it's a tremendous challenge because the exploitation starts in the home country. As far as regulation from governments, we see very good trends, actually, and government interest in this and government regulation of it. I think these are, having worked in the government 20 years ago during the Clinton years on human trafficking, and when we were first trying to find the terms for it, I see a lot of progress that's been made, and I admired your work, Ernie, for many of those years. But I see now, like for the UK government, with their Modern Slavery Act and their new requirements, on firms need to report on what they're doing to end slavery and prevent slavery in their supply chain. We've been very active in working with them, consulting with them on the implementation of the regulations. We've hosted roundtables in London with a number of people in our sector, other engineering and construction and infrastructure firms, and we've invited high-level government officials from the UK to come. It's very important for them to have the private sector understand what the requirements are, and here's the message: there's no wiggle room. I mean, they are looking for an understanding of what you're doing actively to end slavery in your supply chain and what you're doing to prevent that from happening. But it's an open process back and forth. I actually think it's good to have clarity, and I think they're getting at issues that have been kind of there for a while on the labor exploitation side, and I don't think have been defined as well. So we're very aware of those, and we're very involved in.
Just a
working with
follow-up
them.
question to what you said. Do you think it's going to define your role in specific, moving ahead? Your role,
Our firms.
No, your actual role at CH2M.
Well, we have our approach to it is to have a multidisciplinary task force, which involves colleagues like my colleagues in the legal department who are here, Bill Brierly and Neil Thurston, and to have our procurement people, our human resources people rather, our operations people, have everybody sort of build in our new best practices, which is our new worker welfare policy, into the work they do. So it's an important part of my role, and it's very gratifying because to see progress being made both within what we are doing as a company, what we see, movements we see within our own industry, when we see clients accepting and implementing some of the ideas. But I think it has to be broader than one person in a large corporation that's operating around the world. And that's a better way to institutionalize something as well, to really have a number of people who understand what they're trying to get done. We're implementing a new policy that we brought in a fair labor consultant to help us. And they're people who are just as passionate and interested and committed to this all across the company.
Great.
Just a question.
Sure.
Yeah, Ernie, you had mentioned that human trafficking was the people weren't paid. But Teresa, I get the impression from what you said that people are coming over, say in the Gulf states, and getting very low wages but being paid.
There's a whole range of things. So
is human trafficking, you don't pay them, or is it?
It's coercion, force, and fraud.
Yeah.
Those are the key elements, right? And so if you
Yeah.
are recruited from a home country and expect to be made a certain wage, be given a certain wage and earn a certain wage, and you're paid either nothing for a year to pay off the recruitment fees or a very reduced wage after the end of that year, that's fraud, right? And you're forced, in many of the countries, you can't really leave, you don't have the exit permit to be able to leave. So there's all of those elements together, and it's really complex. There's a long string of it.
It's not fraud if somebody does it voluntarily. In other words, if somebody wants to get paid a small amount of money, that's up to the person, right?
Well, I
As
think the
opposed
idea
to
is to
what
live
Ernie
up to
said.
what they're promised. If they're promised a certain thing,
Yeah.
they should be able to receive that pay.
Yeah, but I think, for example, there's a great example in this country. It's called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. And they're basically looking at agricultural workers who have been paid substandard wages and who basically lack the ability to walk away. So there is that element of force, fraud, and coercion, even though they're being paid. The other thing is sometimes the payment is coupled with a kind of indentured servitude, where you're being paid or you're given housing, but you have an obligation toward the labor broker or toward the operator of the thing that is inconceivable that you could pay off. So the equivalent of that is slavery, because you're talking about people who are not being paid a fair wage. What the Coalition of Immokalee Workers have done is they've worked with the food industry to develop standards that are changing the way the food business operates in this country and other countries.
If somebody comes over and accepts it, this is what I want to do, I can't make money down in Mexico, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to make, and I know what you're going to pay me, and it's satisfactory. Is that human trafficking?
Well, I think we have to look at the law in each case. And there are those, for example, in the sex area who basically say, sex workers have rights. Now, what we have found is that overwhelmingly, these are people who lack the ability to walk away, who don't get the money, who are retained and maintained through a variation of manipulative practices, including drugs, violence, and other things. So our assumption in these cases is the vast majority are involuntary,
Right.
even though the worker may say that it's voluntary.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
If somebody comes over knowingly, not involved in the sex trade, saying, oh, look, I can't get a job in Mexico, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to take whatever they give me, and I'm happy as hell that I'm doing it. Is that human trafficking?
Well, I'm deeply skeptical about your premise. Obviously, there are people who come over here to work, but if they're treated unfairly, if they're not paid a living wage, if they lack the ability to do something else, I would argue, yes, it is.
Even if
Yeah.
they do it voluntarily?
Yeah.
Great. Sarah, you had another question?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly make sure I understand when you say they lack the ability to walk away. Are you meaning by force they're unable to walk away, or are there other means through which they may be unable to walk away? I just want to.
Psychological means. I mean, there are multiple means. It's not just force, though I think force is a principal ingredient in this. As Teresa said, the criteria are force, fraud, or coercion.
Mm-hmm.
So coerciveness, runs the gamut.
But I'll say in some countries, may I just add to that? In some countries, you actually need permission from the government to leave the country, right? So when you come into a country, you're sponsored by someone, and you can't leave unless that person says you can leave. So there is restricted mobility. You can't change jobs either within the country. And you can't leave the country unless the government gives you permission. So those are things that are being looked at, and there's some reforms underway. But that's in a very concrete way where people are very much restricted and cannot leave the jobs they're in.
Miss?
Yeah, just to build on that point, I mean, one of the things that we're dealing with at our company with the issues in Thailand with human trafficking is that they don't speak the language. A lot of times they'll come over
Yeah.
and they have a job, they don't speak the language. And then the fishing captains will take their papers, they'll take their passports or whatever it is that they use to get into the country, so they can't go anywhere, they don't know anyone, they don't know how to get out. So it might not be physical force, but there's nowhere that they can go.
And sometimes it's just part of culture, right? So if it's part of a country's culture, Ernie, how do you move beyond that? If it's just in part of the country, the culture itself.
Yes,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think it's a process. It begins with law. You make sure the country has the appropriate law, so you work with leaders, you build awareness, and then you communicate and educate. Mm-hmm. And you provide an avenue, a vehicle for people who are in crisis to reach out and ask for help. So hotlines and other resources. The other thing we're discovering is that many of these countries, even when someone is rescued or gets out of the situation, there's a lack of services and support. So they're living in a terrible situation from which they have no real alternatives. You take them out of that situation, and they're in a terrible situation from which they have no alternatives. So, there's such a vast strategic approach that needs to be built to this if we're going to have impact on it.
Right. And obviously you cannot implement a one-size-fits-all approach. I guess it changes depending on the geographic location, right? Mm-hmm. Letty, do you do anything different at Delta? How do you get compliance involved and raise awareness?
Well, I think, Teresa, you said it so well. It is truly a multidisciplinary approach. Mm-hmm. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it really wasn't on the spectrum of a lot of companies. Today, I think literally in the last 5 or so years, the whole notion that you're bringing awareness to your employees, I think, has exploded in a lot of companies. Now, they may not have moved the needle to do a whole lot because there are a lot of pieces involved, but it has required that more people within the company get involved in the discussion. In our case, obviously, because we are a compliance and a driven organization, we need to make sure that our in-flight customer-facing employees are involved in the conversation because they are there on the front lines. They're able to identify suspicious activity, whether it's on the aircraft, on the ground, et cetera, and other things that we have in place. It also requires our legal department to get involved because as they look at the supply chain, it requires our procurement area to get involved. And one of the things we did in that specific area by way of awareness is to make sure that we have written communication to our potential suppliers. Mm-hmm. So within our code of conduct, we put specific language in to tell you if you want to do business with Delta Airlines, this is what you must do. Otherwise, we're not going to do business with me. And that's a great incentive. It's incents a lot of companies. Mm-hmm. So I think it's an approach within that organization from multiple areas to make sure that everyone is aligned.
Mm-hmm. Kim, I know you do something completely different. For example, at Marriott, you all train security. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. I mean, I wouldn't say necessarily that we do everything differently because we do take a cross-discipline approach. Mm-hmm. We do have a human rights council that exists. We do have policies both for our employees and for our relationships with vendors. We do incorporate some of those policies, for instance, into our business code of conduct and our professional responsibility. And then in terms of training, we do offer training to a wide variety of our associates, both kind of on the front lines, at the hotels, at the front desks. But we also really mandatory require it of our loss prevention officers. So that's something that we've long been committed to, and so we continually, look at the training, try to update the training. But those loss prevention officers are kind of on the front line, and so it is required for them to do it. And then we do try to also kind of holistically always encourage. Again, it's about education and awareness. I think the campaign is, see something, say something, because they are right there on the front lines, and to always coordinate, with law enforcement. And so that's something that is kind of always done, I would say, somewhat behind the scenes, but it's a crucial part of really tackling this challenge. And it's to work with your law enforcement, both locally and, at broader organizations within the government.
Teresa? Would you like to add to that?
Right. So, our approach is when we were first, as we expanded our work in the Middle East and in the Gulf states in the Middle East, and we were taking on major projects with big infrastructure requirements for clients, the need for the workforce was very clear. And it was clear that in some countries there are regulations in place, so there are laws. It's a question of enforcement and capacity for enforcement. So in some places, when we did served as the program managing consultant for doing all the infrastructure for the London Olympics, for example, the UK had very strict regulations in place. We were all set to go and ready to help in any way. Like it was an enabling environment. Those regulations and all of the human rights standards were being really pretty much enforced by the government. So we were very happy to work in that enabling environment. It's a different environment when you're working in a place where 70% of the population is outside workforce that comes in to help with manual labor projects and infrastructure projects. So it is something that as a company we have to look at if we're going to work in those places, which we are encouraged by the human rights groups and lots of other people. Don't walk away from those countries because there's challenging environment and because the standards aren't what you would like to see in place. You have to stay there and use your influence, and we do that. And we brought in, actually, we looked at it internally ourselves, and we looked at our own standards and policies, and we thought, we are working in a much more challenging environment than we were, as Letty said, a few years ago. So we brought in a fair labor consultant called Marriott, and who really worked with us for about a year to help us develop a worker. We call it worker welfare. So we focus on the conditions of the workers and their rights and their livelihoods. And we developed this worker welfare policy, which this very well-known fair labor consultant, Marriott, who does consulting for the UK government, the US government, and a lot of different companies. It was a very interesting process for us because we're pretty smart consultants, but we learned a lot. And now we're in the very active phase of implementation, very robust implementation, and they're helping us with that as well, because that's when you get to the hard pieces of this. Like, so in the procurement, we looked within our own internal procurement when we hire workers to clean our offices, for example, in some of the other countries, or we have people that supply different materials to us. Have we looked at our own supply chain? So we're doing that. We're finding a lot of area for improvement, and we're working with some of those suppliers to put improvement plans in place. But I do think that for companies, and we all have different roles here, but I think companies have a special place and a complicated place in this spectrum of issues that is needed to, and actions that are needed to sort of really end this modern day slavery. And you just can't put yourself on a little channel. You have to kind of look at and work with everybody, with governments, with NGOs, with suppliers, and just be clear about who you are and what you're trying to get done.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point because, when we started the work, I think our focus was on training and making sure that our employees got trained. And I believe to date we are still the only major airline that signed on to the ECPAT code. Mm-hmm. And so with using the ECPAT code and then ultimately working with Customs Border Patrol and Homeland Security with the Blue Lightning campaign, we have been successful ensuring that our customer-facing employees have gone through training, now exceeding more than 68,000 of our employees. Is it an easy task? No. Does it happen overnight? No, and it is ongoing. But you also, Teresa, I'm going to refer back to you because we also over the years have had the opportunity to work with organizations such as Verite. And if you don't really want to know what's going on in your organization, don't call Verite. Because they will definitely bring to light where the gaps are, where the opportunities are. And so your organization, your company may not be ready, but I think there are incremental steps that you can take on that continuum to roll out a strategy. You can't be all things to all people, because again, I still talk to people who, if you ask them what human trafficking is, you're going to get 10 different definitions of what that is. And so I think you have to narrow down, where your company, as you mentioned, we're on a continuum even here at the table of what you want to do. So, whether it's awareness, and then you move into implementation of certain strategies. But we have worked with NGOs. We have worked with other civil societies. We've worked with individuals. I'm sure you have the same thing. Once we introduced human trafficking within our business community, I was just amazed at how many of our employees they were already engaged in work on their own. They were then excited, almost honored to have a company to step out with in this particular arena and say, oh my goodness, understanding the risks. I know we're going to talk a little bit about that, or a ding on your brand, so to speak. And then we called in experts like Ernie, who's literally been at Delta a number of times, to continue to emphasize how important this body of work is.
You want to say something?
Yeah, one of the key aspects of this is an internal process to look, and then a reporting mechanism. And Teresa mentioned regulations around the world. One of the challenges in this country in particular is that there is no mandate to report. Now, it's changing in the rest of the world. The EU just mandated reporting, but it has to be enacted legislatively in all the EU member countries. The Johannesburg Stock Exchange mandates integrated reporting for all 450 companies that are a member of that stock exchange. So if you're a member of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, you have to report not just a financial report on the performance of your company, but you also have to report on sustainability, ESG type reporting. So one of the challenges here, Letty and I are members of an advisory board on this issue for the McCain Institute, Senator John McCain and his wife Cindy McCain, who are fervent on this issue. They did a survey last year with the American Bar Association. They looked at the Fortune 100, and they found that of the Fortune 100, 54% have human trafficking policies in place, and 66% have policies in place on forced labor. Now that's progress. That's a good thing. But it still means that half of America's Fortune 500 does not have existing policy on this. And one of the challenges is that there are companies that report on their performance in these kinds of areas, but it is not standardized reporting. It is reporting that may in a lot of ways not be as meaningful. And in my view, that sort of reporting can be self-serving and can get your company in trouble if you don't do it seriously and properly. So I think we have a long way to go. I think there's growing recognition that it's in the business interest of corporations in this country and around the world to look at these issues, to report to the public on what they're doing about the issues, and because I think increasingly, we heard it yesterday, increasingly this is going to influence investment decisions, not just financials, but the non-financial, the ESG type issues are going to increasingly influence investment decisions. All of us in this country have advocated that all other things being equal, it's better that this not be regulated, that it not be mandated by government. But in order to sustain that position, the reporting and the examination of these issues needs to be meaningful. It needs to be consistent and uniform. And there's some mechanisms for guiding on that today. But U.S. companies are still not doing it in as comprehensive a way as they need to do it.
So I've been hearing a lot about policy, and this is a question to the entire panel. What should a human trafficking policy contain? What are your thoughts on that? Teresa?
Well, for the policy we developed with the good help and guidance of Verite, really looks at all of the issues that affect a worker from when the worker leaves their home country to come to another country to work, right? So we look at the recruitment, we look at the person's mobility, being able to move from job to job within the country, their ability to be able to return home, to be paid the wages they were promised, to have safe and healthy conditions on the job site, and then ultimately to be able to return home. But in many of the human rights organizations we work with, one of the top key issue for many of these workers, especially those who are leaving their home country and coming to do manual labor in another country, is the ability to send money home. They would like nice accommodations, that's very good, and a lot of, our Western sensibility, we look at the accommodations issue, where are people living, what is their food like, that's important to us, we look at that. But for these workers, and that's an important part of it overall, but the ability to send money home and the money they were promised is the overarching thing, because that's why they left their home. That's why people came together to get money from the village to be able to send this person out to work. And there are mental health issues when they can't send the money home. They feel ashamed. They're letting their family down. They're embarrassed. So the biggest part of this is the making sure people get paid. So for our policy, though, is very comprehensive, looks at all of those issues, talks about our commitment to work within our own internal supply chain of our company, of where we do direct procurement, and then to offer these services to clients and to encourage clients to look at these. But we have pages and pages of guidance notes, because we do look at how many workers in a room, what should the health and safety conditions be on the site. It addresses the issues of recruitment fee, which is, to me, the most challenging by far of all the issues, because it's, where the person starts off in debt and being exploited at the very beginning. Mm-hmm. So we look at all of that, but we also, seek for continuous improvement. But I will say this, as one of the conditions of working with Marriott, and then at the end of the process, they agreed that our policy met their standards, which was very important to us, that we agreed to share our policy with others in our sector and our guidance notes. So it's on our website. We do make it available to people. We host roundtables. We've done 5 or 6 roundtables with our industry in the U.S. and the U.K., in the Middle East, to share this and we're finding lots of allies and people who are also concerned about this issue and want to share their best practices. So for us, collaboration within our industry is really important, because we're all I don't mean to just focus on the Middle East countries, but some of the Gulf states, countries in the Middle East, they bring in a lot of folks who come in as the engineering consultants from the UK and from Europe, and they really kind of look to us for our engineering expertise. So I think we have a better chance at influencing if we're coming together to work together. That's what we're trying to do.
Does anyone in the audience have anything that you do differently as far as policy goes? Miss?
I had a question on really the value of policy versus actually auditing and going in and seeing if people are following policy, because it feels like you put a supplier code of conduct out there, but if a company is willing to use forced labor, I think they're probably willing to violate the code of conduct even if they signed off on it. So is that really meaningful? And what, in particular, what does Marriott suggest in terms of going in and doing on-the-ground audit? Do you outsource that entirely? Do you try to have your people out there, seeing what's going on in practice as well?
You do need a policy because you need standards. And we thought, well, everybody knows what we would do because we're a good engineering company, and we have we are important players in the Ethisphere Summit every year. We take this very seriously. But when you get right down to the nitty-gritty, you have to have standards, right? And so auditing those and monitoring those within our own supply chain, we are doing that in a robust way, right? And the more you look, you said earlier, if you don't see human trafficking, you're not looking. So the more you look, the more you see, and the more that we realize we need tighter controls, and we put those in place. We actually, for our clients who are, folks who are doing the big sporting events or infrastructure projects or, water treatment plants or roads in the Middle East and projects that we help with that, we actually provide that service. We go in and we have us or the subcontractors that we hire to help us with this go into camps and work sites and look at that. I mean, the issue of the full spectrum of treatment of workers that come in from other countries and how they how they're treated and their well-being is similar in this current day to where the health and safety on construction sites was 20 or 30 years ago. And a lot of people in our sector, I wasn't in our sector at that time, and working within the engineering construction sector, but they say at the early stages of health and safety, developing healthy safety standards, there was a lot of, they come, we don't have to worry about that. They're lucky to have a job. And then it turns out that it's just the business imperative, right? Because if workers are healthy and well-nourished, they're going to, perform better, and you're not going to have to keep having turnover. And it's the same thing we think with the worker welfare piece, that when we have workers who come to the site well-nourished without worrying about if they're able to send money home, that we're going to ultimately have a more productive workforce. But you're right, absolutely right about implementation and auditing, but you have to have standards to start with.
Thank you. Sir, you had a question?
I was going to just add really quickly that, policies are a management tool. And in our case, it's also, it's if you want to do business with the company, this is what you need to do. And as an employee, if you are also not abiding by this policy, your employment could be terminated. So it's very much needed.
Thank you.
in
Sir?
companies.
I'm Mike Moran from Control Risks, and I'm on the Communications Advisory for Human Rights Watch.
Oh.
And I just love that you keep coming back to worker welfare, because I think one of the problems that we've, at Human Rights Watch and my other hat, have identified is that to couch this all as trafficking and slavery, it takes it out of the realm of reality for corporates. They just can't believe that this would be going on. This is something that happens in Darfur, not in my supply chain. And in fact, on the other side, my control risk hat, I see it all the time, that it's usually unwitting, but it does exist in supply chains. So I think, what you're talking about in terms of worker rights, looking at it from the standard, because you can certainly be abused as a worker and not have been trafficked. First in the Gulf, how many men are prosecuted by the Gulf's judicial system for sexual abuse of a guest worker? Probably none, right? Because the guest worker is terrified to say something. So, these are the kind of issues that I think, if you take it out of the realm of sex slaves and trafficking, it gets to be more real, because it's really about whether these workers have recourse, whether they have the ability to exit the country, and whether they're making a living wage or indentured, as you described.
But there's vulnerability for companies in this, whatever you call it, however you define it. In the world of globalization, there are companies with thousands of suppliers. And how do you audit, or how do you control a supply chain that is so far-reaching? And there's still a lot of companies that are so frightened of civil liability that they would rather not know about it than to take the effort to find out about it. There are also some extraordinary models of incentivizing the suppliers to begin to address these issues. For example, Levi Strauss, which has had a major issue in terms of forced labor and these kinds of issues in the manufacture of clothing, entered into an agreement with the World Bank in which they're offering discounts on capital loans for suppliers if they'll take certain basic steps. So it becomes not only the right thing to do, but it becomes something that's beneficial to the supplier to do. So the challenge is how we can do that, how we can scale it so that it can be done more broadly. But I still believe that the key issue is looking for the problem and reporting what you're doing about it. And there's still a bunch of companies that are not doing that.
One question. Oh, Ben?
How do you guys, you mentioned labor brokers briefly. That seems to be a big fulcrum point where this all happens. How can companies work around labor brokers when they're so pervasive, and a lot of them are connected to organized crime gangs that if they don't hurt the worker, they know where the worker's family is and they can get to them that way? You were talking about the psychological part of this. That's part of that too.
It's difficult, but you just have to dig in. You have to probe it. You have to try not to use them or regulate the process that you're being used. I mean, the brick kilns in India, and these things are rife with this sort of thing. So you make sure you have appropriate law. One of the challenges we see, somebody mentioned earlier, the use of law enforcement and investigation and prosecution in these cases. there's much of the world where law enforcement basically looks the other way on this because of the economic implications. So one of the things we want to do is simply build the capacity and the awareness of law enforcement to address the impunity. You know, investigating and prosecuting can change minds in a hurry.
Is there a way to
It's
tell
two
your
questions.
suppliers- You tell your suppliers, if you use a broker, we're not going to do business with you? Is that where they put the pressure on those people because they have that local influence? Or
Sure.
does that create problems then for you getting the workers you need?
I'm the non-corporate
Sure,
person here.
Actually, we don't hire workers directly on any of the projects in the Middle East, but we do advise clients on ways to avoid fraud within that actually procurement. I mean, actually, you're procuring that labor. But there are different initiatives underway right now. For example, Humanity United, which some of you may know is a foundation started by the founders of eBay, and they focus a lot on human freedom and trying to eradicate human trafficking. And they're sponsoring different technology tools and developing different technology tools. We're working with them on one. They're looking at how to sort of bypass the recruiters, which would be a very, very significant thing if that were to happen, because it is organized criminal activity, and there's corruption and several stages of this, whether the person's leaving their country before they can get their passport, when they leave their country, when they enter the new country, and if there is a Ministry of Labor that comes around and does inspections, the ministry not doing the inspection in the proper way. So there's lots of corruption in that. One of the technology pilot tests that we're involved in with Humanity United and San Francisco-based software developer called Caravan is looking at a device that the workers can use where they would report their concerns. So it's not a necessary complaint device, but they would report on their living conditions or working conditions. Now, I was very surprised to hear that 80% of the workers who are coming in from India and Nepal and Pakistan and other places who come into the Gulf have access to handheld devices. I was very surprised to hear that, but that is the case. And we're trying to help develop an app that would be test piloted on some of our projects in the region. And that would then have the workers report their concerns or their conditions directly up to us. So we're at the top level working with the client, not the 3 or 4 levels of subs in between. And it allows us to address it more quickly, to hold those subs accountable, to ultimately address those concerns for the client and address the concerns from the worker. But then from the client's perspective, the client will have a compliant project where the conditions that are often in the regulations and in the laws of the country are actually met, just not enforced. So we'd be helping with that, but then the worker would have a voice that is not filtered down or delayed by several other layers in the chain. So technology is one approach. We're not there yet, though, because that is the greatest challenge. It's the recruitment fraud and the coercion in the sending countries.
I like your idea of technology, and we'll touch on that topic in a few. Miss, go ahead.
Okay, I'm Taruna from Tata Power, India, and I just heard the panel. My compliments to all of you. You have touched on all the aspects of on that. But I just have to say a few things here. One is definitely there's a framework. There are frameworks available. The ILO has a framework. SRI, Sustainability Reporting Initiatives, have a framework. GRI has a framework, Global Reporting Initiatives. Now the policy, which you say the human trafficking policy, it's again a different policy which is creating a framework that how to do the business or how to engage with people and how to respect people in the society. But don't you think it has to come from within, like, okay, we need to have that framework that we have a more integrated approach towards care, towards intent, towards the human value system, so that these things are addressed at when they are just coming out or they are just getting out of the it's getting, like, what I mean to say is that when they are just starting, the problem is just starting. Rather than getting into the policy, obviously there are models where we do audit and all, the audit processes, but it all starts from the human values, from the culture, from where we are starting our business, so in the supply chain. So we need to have more of governance around it rather than putting everything under with a stick. Don't have to go around.
Does Tata Steel do anything new? I'm just curious.
See, actually in India, we don't have human trafficking policy as of now. But when we do business with international companies, even within our supply chain for Taj Hotels, because Tata is a big group in India. It's a $100 billion group in India. And what we say as a vision for our company that will be, by 2025, we'll be touching 2 billion people's life. And we need to be responsible in our conduct, in our business, in every single way possible. So when we talk about this, we never say that in 2025 we will be $200 billion company. We never talk about it, economics. But we always say that we'll be touching the lives of people. We need to do business responsibly, and we need to see that we need to have checks and balances in place so that things should not go wrong in our supply chain or in our organizations. So we come from there, we educate people on that, we have a code of conduct around it, we follow GRI, we follow SRI, and obviously our funding agencies are IFCs and ADVs of the bank, ADVs of the world. So that's how we follow our practices. I still feel that it has to come from within rather than having a policy framework. That is definitely a supporting that thing, but that's what we feel. I don't know whether I'm right. You can just put a right on it. Thank you.
Well, I mean, just briefly, one of the challenges is there are all these frameworks, which are basically guidance. And for example, in this country, there is something called the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board,
Yes.
which for sustainability is supposed to be the counterpart of the FASB on financial, but it's voluntary, it's advisory. So I think the more we can move to a uniform reporting standard, and I understand that it's people are not wildly enthusiastic about that being regulated or governmentally mandated. But one of the problems we have now is everybody's doing it in a different way.
Miss?
Yeah, I mean, what we, Alison Taylor, from what from the SR, what we tend to hear in terms of human rights issues in general is a lot of companies can manage it within their organisation. The problems are obviously the supply chains, but they're the suppliers. They're the contractors. Who's a guy with a mobile phone, so even if you wanted to arrest and prosecute them, that's difficult. And I think what companies say to me privately is this is just an overwhelming challenge, whether it's trafficking or child labour or whatever it is, and so there is a tendency not to look too hard. And it reminds me of corruption 5 years ago, and I wonder if the emergence of a sort of equivalent of adequate procedures and demonstrating that what you've done is sufficient would help companies tackle this challenge, because I think it does remind me of corruption in this sense that if we look, God knows what we'll find. We'll just have a really robust policy, we'll have a supplier code of conduct, but the actual issues are much further down.
Any thoughts on that?
I actually think there's an appetite, certainly in our company. I mean, when our CEO first received a letter from Human Rights Watch a couple of years ago, she became very engaged in this, and it's not. She's also very concerned about the morale of our company. So if there are press reports linking us to slavery-like conditions on some project in Qatar, that has a huge effect on the way our 23,000 employees see themselves. And when there's someone who protests against something that we do and puts bloody body bags on Facebook pages, the personal Facebook pages of our employees, that has a huge effect on the way people see themselves and see this company. And we pride ourselves on taking our work seriously and trying to be a force for good in the world. So there's many factors that motivate, first of all, our CEO, who is driven to deliver the best engineering and consulting services to our clients, and that includes figuring out how we can be a force for good in this and to have an effect on others. But it affects our employees as well, and that was a really interesting thing for us. Was some of our colleagues were saying, why are we working in those countries? Those are just terrible places, and I mean, we should leave there. And we have some of the human rights organizations telling us, stay there and use your influence and try to bring others along in the industry. I actually think I don't think people are looking to trying to look the other way. We've had a lot of roundtables with people in our same kind of work that we're doing. And I don't see people, I mean, maybe they're the ones not coming to the roundtables, the ones who are trying to avoid it. But the others are actually trying different pieces of it.
It's just the challenge is so huge.
Yeah.
And supply chain issues are still very issue specific, whether it's kind of apparel, factory
Right.
conditions. At the moment, it's human trafficking or child labour. So
Yeah.
there'll be an incident, and then public and regulatory concern will kind of coalesce around something. But supply chain issues are enormous. So
Right.
I think
You have to
that
start
we
somewhere,
don't know
though.
where the next scandal is going to come from.
Right.
Right.
But I think, you know, if you build things in and you get enough people focusing on that within your own company, and people, when we see a red flag, like the last person who saw a red flag on this issue was quite removed from any of the people I've worked with on a daily basis in the company, which was a very good sign to me. They saw something and they reported up the chain. But I know my colleague Bill Brierley has something he wants to add.
Well, I was just going to say, I think you're seeing a convergence here from at least the view of the regulators. If you listen to the Department of Justice, they are viewing engagement in human trafficking or in worker welfare schemes as a corrupt practice. Yeah. So I think you'll begin to see some enforcement in this area on the corrupt practices side.
Yeah, which is interesting.
Which is very interesting, but I also think it's a great dynamic for companies to begin to get this issue in front of the right people at the company. It's not just a supply chain issue anymore, it's now a Corrupt Practices Act issue. And I think everyone, at least at a board level, is familiar enough with that to where if you begin framing the debate in that regard, you'll get some buy-in, you'll get some understanding quickly.
Excellent point. And I'm so sorry, but we only have time for one more question. Ed, you had a question?
No, I just want to kind of play off of what the gentleman said. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges is that we've actually got this kind of cosmic conceptual issue. I mean, piracy and the slave trade are the only two crimes that are actually of universal jurisdiction. And they're both of the things that we thought we'd gotten rid of. And now that when they've both been presented to us, it's not only a question of dealing with it, it becomes this kind of question of how do we even conceptualize it. We want to put it in a box as corruption because we know how to deal with that. But I think the biggest challenge is, how do we begin to understand it, and then how do we begin to put it together across the board, as people said, the kind of universality of the standards. But until I think people begin to realize, in some ways, it is a conceptual issue about how do we deal with the reality that we didn't think existed anymore, is a really interesting point.
Great, thank you for that. Just to wrap up, any final thoughts from the panelists on this topic?
I would just say the work continues. I mean, this is just one example, one discussion, and I've been a part of many of them, but same concerns, but definitely still needed.
All I would add is I think all human progress is a byproduct of leadership. Delta is leading the airline industry because of Letty, but also because your CEO, Richard Anderson, said this is important, and we want to do whatever we need to do. So I think the more corporate leaders begin to talk about this issue and say this is not acceptable, and secondly, that doing the right thing is good business. It doesn't just expose the company to additional liability, it enhances the reputation of the company and its ability to succeed and prosper. So the Ratan Tatas of the world and others need to be the voices who are awakening other business leaders to the need to lead on this issue.
And I would say, if you were to, like, what is the one thing that's most significant for us in trying to address this issue, and it's our CEO's commitment to this. Our CEO, Jacqueline Hinman, treats this as, anything else. She expects us to be the best in our industry, to be ahead of the curve, to offer the very best things to our clients so they can be doing what they should do. And we have a board of directors, and then we have a board committee that we report into now. I mean, and there are high expectations. So I think collaboration, having good, strong leadership in your company, and that has an effect on other people. It certainly has an effect on our working group and the way we look at this. But it has an effect on how our clients see it too, and that's important because those are the people we're trying to influence.
And I would just say, I think Marriott's committed to this too. It's something that we've worked on for years. We continue to work on it, both, I would say, from our workforce, our supplier chain, and also in the industry. It's something that we've taken up, and we work with our industry association to help raise awareness across the board and outside of Marriott. So that's something the company's been committed to. And I think the other thing that, and those are tough, I would say tough discussions, tough policies to implement. And then the other thing is to kind of, at the end of the day, put a human face on this. And so we do, I think, Ernie, you mentioned earlier, the victims. And so that's something Marriott has also looked to, is to kind of help with initiatives for victims of human trafficking and helping them live self-sustaining lives and putting in programs and supporting those programs. So that's something that Marriott has also been committed to, which really is kind of a full spectrum of how you tackle such a challenging issue.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for joining us. Next up on the agenda is the networking break in the Empire State Ballroom 5. Thank you.
I'm going back today. I'm going to take a